She had gone. Bailey, the faithful Australian shepherd, never wandered far from home. She had just given birth to 5 puppies, and her world didn't extend beyond the back porch, surrounded by peaceful woods. But that afternoon, she disappeared among the trees and didn't return. Hours passed. The puppies whimpered. The family desperately searched for her, calling her name while daylight faded. Panic gripped everyone. Had she fallen victim to a predator? Had she gotten trapped? Then, just before dusk, a gentle sound among the trees announced her return. Bailey emerged covered in dirt, but she wasn't alone. In her jaws, held with incredible delicacy, she carried a small spotted creature. At first they thought it was a kitten, but as they approached, they saw pointed ears and wild eyes. It was a young lynx, weak and nearly lifeless. Nobody moved. The small animal barely breathed, motionless in Bailey's gentle grip. It didn't growl or resist, just lay there, limp and cold. The family, stunned, finally reacted. They approached carefully, speaking softly. Bailey placed it on the porch, never taking her eyes off it. One of the children brought a blanket. The father brought a box with towels. They moved quickly, but with utmost caution, as if one mistake could sever the fragile thread that still kept it alive. The lynx kitten was light, its fur damp and matted. It breathed shallowly and irregularly. They placed a warm blanket over it and began giving it sweetened water with a dropper. At first it only licked weakly, but then it did so again. Meanwhile, Bailey's 5 puppies cried from their pen. They had been without their mother for hours, pushing against each other, howling and whimpering. Bailey returned to them briefly, licked each one in turn with her tail lowered but gently wagging. They were safe, no longer alone. The lynx kitten remained on the porch, wrapped in the blanket, under the family's watchful gaze through the window. Nobody knew what to do, or even if it would survive the night. But Bailey seemed to know. From time to time she would approach to smell it, checking its breathing, always careful, always alert. She hadn't just brought home a lost creature. She had brought life. The next morning the air was warmer, but the kitten barely moved. It remained curled up, breathing with difficulty. The family had hardly slept, checking on it constantly, placing warm water bottles and whispering words of comfort, as if it could understand. Bailey never left its side. When she fed her puppies, she returned to the porch and lay down beside the box, pressing her body to the floor, as if her very presence could anchor the kitten to the world. Finally, the little one opened its eyes. They were glassy and unfocused, but it was alive. The family contacted a local veterinarian who dealt with wild animals, though they didn't know what the law said or what questions to ask. For now, all that mattered was that it needed warmth, food, and time. They named it Aspen. The next day they moved its box inside. Bailey watched as it began to move slowly to sniff. She stayed close, never aggressive, always watchful. Aspen seemed to recognize something in her. It didn't flinch when she approached, nor did it flee when Bailey licked the top of its head with the same tenderness with which she cared for her own puppies. And then something changed. While the family watched, Aspen stood on trembling legs and stepped out of the box, taking a few steps. Bailey stood up too. Her puppies from the corner watched him with wide eyes. Aspen approached without growling or hissing, only with curiosity. One of the puppies barked, frightened by the new scent, but Bailey made a quiet, calm sound from her throat. That was enough. That night, Aspen curled up beside the puppies. He wasn't part of the group, not entirely, but he wasn't a stranger either. He was a guest, a question, perhaps a beginning. By the end of the week, Aspen had not only survived, but was changing. The wildness in him hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. He followed Bailey at a few steps' distance, watching how she moved, how she cared for her little ones. He would sit nearby when they played, watching first, then beginning to imitate them. His movements were careful, uncertain, but in his eyes there was no longer fear, only a deep longing to belong. One morning, when the puppies were playing on a blanket in the living room, Aspen approached. Ark, the boldest, stood before him with his nose raised. Aspen backed away. Tension filled the room for a moment until Bailey intervened. She stood between both of them, observed them, and then gently licked Aspen's ear, pushing him toward the group. An invitation, permission, and that was the moment when everything changed. From then on, Aspen was no longer just a stranger, circling on the edges of the nest. Now he was with them. He chased tails, batted at toys, and slept in the warm pile of fur, nestled among his adopted siblings, breathing in the same rhythm as them. And Bailey, she treated him like one of them. She cleaned him, corrected him, protected him. Her instincts didn't question whether he belonged there. They simply knew this was one of hers. The family watched in amazement. This wild animal, born in the depths of the forest, had found safety not in a burrow or among branches, but in the gentle heartbeat of home. And he didn't try to leave. He didn't look toward the forest. He had found his place in the warm breath of a mother and among the intertwined bodies of puppies who no longer saw anything in him other than a brother. As days passed, Aspen grew stronger. His paws strengthened. His eyes brightened with greater clarity. His dull coat gave way to a healthy, soft shine. He had an appetite not only for food, but for contact, warmth, for life itself. The family took turns feeding him from a special bottle, carefully combing the matted fur behind his ears, and speaking to him in the same tender tone they used with the puppies. At first they were cautious, they weren't sure. A wild lynx wasn't meant to live in a house full of colorful blankets and chew toys. But Aspen changed that. He didn't hide, didn't scratch or bite. He moved through the house as if he belonged there, as if the walls recognized him. He cuddled by the fireplace, slept with his head on a child's foot, followed the family from room to room, calm, always observing, as if he had lived there forever. Bailey watched over him with the same devotion as her own puppies, and they, growing quickly, no longer noticed the difference. Aspen was simply another one, perhaps bigger, perhaps quieter, but completely theirs. Gradually, the family began to feel the same. They knew the forest had been his first home. They knew wild animals weren't meant to live between walls, but Aspen had chosen, and Bailey had stayed close to him since that cold night. He never tried to return. It seemed like something more than coincidence. Maybe Bailey hadn't found him by accident. Maybe she heard him, felt him, knew. Maybe she hadn't brought home a lost kitten, but someone who was always meant to be with them. Weeks passed peacefully. Aspen thrived. He was stronger, faster, more confident. He played with the puppies like a brother, slept with them tangled in that warm pile of fur and synchronized breaths. The rhythm of the house was his. He knew every creaking door, every voice, every hand that reached out to pet him. And then came the official letter, folded, sealed by the Department of Wildlife Protection. Someone had reported them. An anonymous complaint, a lynx being kept illegally in a family home. The message was clear. According to state law, possessing a wild animal like Aspen was strictly prohibited. It didn't matter how tame he was. They were given 7 days to turn him over to an authorized rehabilitation center. Silence filled the house. The puppies stopped playing, sensing the tension. Bailey stood beside Aspen, firmly, protectively, with raised ears and alert eyes. Aspen didn't understand what was happening, only looked up calmly, expecting the next moment in his world of safety. But for the family, everything collapsed. He wasn't a threat or danger. He had grown up under this roof, eating from the same bowls, chasing the same toys. He purred in his sleep, blinked slowly when they whispered his name. He had a heart that beat in rhythm with their hearts. They couldn't understand why he had to leave, why the smell of wood and warm blankets had to be exchanged for cold cages and strangers. To the world he was still a lynx. To them, he was their home. The 7th day came with rain. That morning the family hugged Aspen. He didn't resist, didn't fight, just rested his head on the girl's chest, breathing in her scent, as if trying to remember it forever. Then he left. The wildlife team was respectful. They placed him carefully in a padded box and loaded him into the van. The doors closed with a soft click that nonetheless sounded like thunder in the silence of the house. They took him 50 kilometers away to a specialized and secure facility, a center created to help wild animals return to nature. When they opened the box, Aspen didn't move. He emerged slowly, walked once around the enclosure with its concrete floor, and lay down in the farthest corner. He didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't snarl or growl. He simply waited. At home, Bailey went through the house room by room, searching for him. She smelled the empty blanket where Aspen used to sleep, then lay down beside it and refused to move. She stopped eating. The puppies ran through the corridors, barking at shadows, chewing toys that were soon forgotten. The house was still full of noise, but the warmth had gone. Something essential, something deep had been torn from the center of their world. The children asked when Aspen would return. The parents didn't know what to say. At the wildlife center, Aspen remained silent. He didn't explore, didn't react to other nearby animals. He stared at the same corner for hours. The staff noticed that his vital signs were stable, but something was missing from him. He wasn't angry or frightened. He was grieving. The house felt empty, but the family wasn't ready to give up. They didn't fight the law, but they filed a petition. a quiet and respectful request to allow Aspen to return home, at least for a while, so he could strengthen in the only place where he truly lived. They proposed that he stay under supervision, with regular checks by specialists, and when the time came, when instinct awakened and nature called him, then he could choose his path. They knew there were rules, but they also knew Aspen. They wrote letters, published photos and shared videos. One showed Aspen curled up with the puppies being tenderly cleaned by Bailey as if he were her own. A video lasting just 23 seconds, where Aspen slept with his paw on Bailey's muzzle, went viral in less than a day. Thousands of people responded. Comments poured in from all corners of the country. Teachers, parents, veterinarians, zookeepers. Nobody saw a wild animal. They saw a son, a brother, a miracle. The family contacted biologists specializing in wildlife, hoping someone could help them, and they succeeded. A senior researcher from the regional university reviewed hours of recordings and wrote a formal statement. His words were simple but powerful. Aspen's behavior is not typical of a wild lynx. He shows lasting attachment to the domestic dog that raised him along with her litter. He identifies with them as his social group. Forcing him into standard reintegration with wildlife could cause irreversible psychological damage. The petition exceeded 10,000 signatures, then 20,000, then more. Something was changing, not only in public opinion, but also among officials who reviewed the case. The story had transformed into something more than a family and their rescued lynx. It had become a matter of compassion and choice. 2 weeks after the campaign began, the phone rang. It was the Wildlife Protection Department. The voice on the other end was calm, thoughtful but gentler than before. After reviewing the expert's report and in the face of overwhelming public support, they had made a decision. An exception would be made. Aspen could return home. With conditions, of course. He would be under official observation as part of a study on wildlife adaptation, with regular visits from specialists and in a controlled environment with detailed reports. But most importantly, he would be with his family. The day Aspen returned was quiet. There were no cameras, press, or applause, just the sound of the van pulling into the driveway. The doors opened and Bailey was first to stand. She ran up with raised ears and a tense, expectant tail. Aspen entered the house with careful steps, but then he saw her. All doubts vanished. He moved toward Bailey with lowered head and relaxed body. He licked her face once, then a second time, and finally lay down beside her to cuddle with her. The puppies ran in, barking and flying between paws and tails. Aspen didn't pull away. He stayed with them, moving among the joyful bodies, greeting each one as if he had never left. The family watched in silence. There were tears, smiles, long sighs held back too long. Aspen was home, not as a guest, not as a secret, not as a wild animal with a ticking clock. He was home with a name, with status, with a future. Aspen stayed. He grew along with the puppies, who were now frenzied teenagers. Their games were louder, faster, wilder, but Aspen always followed them. He chased butterflies around the yard, rolled in the grass, ran after scents that only he could understand. They were a family, not united by blood, but by bond. A tangle of paws, laughter, and love. Aspen no longer had to prove that he belonged. He simply belonged. But as the seasons passed, something in him began to change. Sometimes he would sit on the edge of the forest for long moments, with ears alert, nose to the wind. From time to time he would disappear among the trees for hours and return at dusk, calm and silent. What was old in him was beginning to awaken. The family understood this. They never tried to cage him. From the beginning they promised that when the time came, Aspen would have a choice, to stay or to leave. And when that day came, they would open the door without a word. Because true love doesn't hold back. It sets free. Maybe someday Aspen will return to the forest that almost lost him, but he will never be lost again. He will carry with him everything he was given: warmth, safety, belonging. Because once, in the heart of winter, a bitch found a wild kitten and made it her own.